I want to start with the sound, not the sound of what she said. The sound that came after the specific sound of an attorney's leather portfolio hitting a courtroom table harder than he meant it to, because his hand had stopped cooperating with him. That sound lasted maybe half a second. I have turned that half a second over in my mind more times than I can count, folks, because everything that happened afterward, everything I'm about to tell you, was contained inside it. 4 seconds before that sound, my wife of 26 years looked a federal judge in the eye and told him I was a man who'd wasted his life. 4 seconds. I didn't move. I didn't look at her, or at her lawyer, or at my own daughter sitting stone-faced in the gallery behind me. I looked at the judge. And the judge, I want you to understand this, the judge looked back at me the way one engineer looks at another engineer across a room full of people who don't know what either of them actually does for a living. Something passed between us. Then he set his pen down very slowly and said, "Counsel, before we continue, do you have any idea who this man is?" And that's when the portfolio hit the table. Friends, if you're just joining me, welcome to the channel. Grab a coffee, get comfortable. Hit subscribe if this is your first time here, because you are about to hear how a woman who spent 2 decades calling me the boring one found out, in open court, exactly what boring had built. Stay with me till the end, because what that judge said after the recess is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 66 years old, and for 34 years I was a structural engineer, the kind nobody notices until a building doesn't fall down. I specialize in seismic retrofitting, which is a fancy way of saying I figure out how to keep hospitals and schools standing when the ground underneath them decides to misbehave. I hold 19 patents, not applications granted, registered patents, sitting in the U.S. Patent Office right now, covering base isolation systems that are currently protecting 11 hospitals across 3 states, including one that came through a 6.1 earthquake 4 years ago without so much as a hairline crack in its foundation. I'm telling you this, not to brag, my friend. I'm telling you this because my wife stood up in front of a judge and called me a man who never built anything worth mentioning. And I need you to understand the size of what she was actually saying, because she knew she was there for every single one of those 19 patents. She was there the night the first one got approved, back in 1999, when I came home at midnight buzzing like a kid and she looked up from the television and said, "Does this mean you'll finally stop working weekends?" Let me tell you about Diane. Diane Kessler, maiden name Reyes, was the sharpest, most magnetic woman I had ever seen in my life when I met her at a county fundraiser in 1997. I was 37. I'd spent the better part of 15 years buried in load calculations and soil reports. And I was, to put it plainly, a man who did not know how to work a room. Diane worked rooms the way I worked, equations instinctively, fluently, like she'd been born fluent in a language I'd never even studied. She was a district sales manager for a commercial furniture company back then. Confident, quick. People remembered her name after 30 seconds of conversation. I found that terrifying and irresistible in roughly equal measure. We married the following spring. For a long time, it worked, because it worked the way a lot of marriages work. She handled the world of people, I handled the world of steel and concrete, and neither of us looked too closely at whether those two worlds actually needed each other. The trouble, if I'm honest with you, started the way trouble like this always starts quietly, and then all at once. My second patent came through in 2003, a bracing system for retrofitting older brick buildings, and the licensing checks that started coming in weren't life-changing, but they were steady. Diane asked me once, almost as an afterthought over dinner, "So companies just pay you for an idea?" I said yes. She said, "Huh." That was the whole conversation. By 2010, I had 8 patents and a standing consulting contract with the State Emergency Management Office. To Diane, none of it registered as anything more than Walter's engineering thing. I was the guy in the back room at parties, the one people politely disengaged from after I said the word seismic twice. She never said it unkindly. Not back then. She'd just gently redirect conversations away from my work like she was steering a shopping cart around a spill on the floor. I told myself that was fine. I told myself for a long time that it was fine. By 2016, I had 14 patents, and one of them, the base isolation bearing system, the one I mentioned a minute ago, got picked up by a major structural engineering firm that retrofits hospitals nationwide. The royalty terms were tied to units installed, and once hospitals actually started installing the thing, the numbers stopped being modest. I remember exactly where I was standing in our kitchen in the fall of 2018 when I told Diane what the quarterly royalty statement said. She read the number twice. She said, "Is that a typo?" I said, "No." She said, "From one bracket thing?" I said, "From one licensing agreement, on one patent, out of 19. She sat down at the kitchen table, still holding the paper, and looked at it for what felt like a full minute. And then she said the sentence I want to tell you word for word, my friend, because it's the sentence that made 20 years of our marriage make sense to me all at once. She said, "Well, I guess it was worth putting up with all those weekends after all." Putting up with. I stood there in my own kitchen and thought about every Saturday I'd spent in a home office running calculations while she went to brunch with friends and told them her husband was working on his little projects. I thought about every dinner party where she'd introduced me as an engineer. Don't ask him to explain it. You'll regret it. Always with a laugh, always landing just slightly wrong. I thought about 20 years of being managed, politely, like a mildly embarrassing hobby she'd learned to tolerate, putting up with. I said, "Diane, I need to think about something." She said, "What?" I said, "Whether we actually want the same life." She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, or maybe I had, and I just never had the vocabulary to name it until that exact moment. It was the look of someone doing math, fast math. And once I noticed it, my friend, I couldn't stop noticing it. The next year and a half is the part of this story I have to walk you through carefully, because the shift wasn't dramatic, it was gradual, in the particular way that things become gradual once an imbalance has finally been spoken out loud, even obliquely, and both people in the room know it's been spoken, and neither one is quite ready to admit what they're going to do about it. Diane got interested in my work, genuinely interested, or something that did a very good impression of genuine. She came to a regional engineering conference where I was giving a keynote, first time in 11 years of marriage she'd ever done that. She asked good questions at dinner. She was, when she chose to be, the most charming woman in any room, and she chose to be that woman constantly, that whole year and a half. But she also started asking a different category of question: how the patents were held, whether the licensing income ran through a business entity or came straight to me personally, what our estate plan looked like, and whether it needed updating. I'm a structural engineer, friends. I don't react to a single data point. I log it, and I wait to see if the pattern repeats itself. It repeated itself. In February, Diane told me she wanted a divorce. She said it on a Sunday morning, over coffee, with the specific calm of a woman who'd rehearsed the moment more than once. She said, "I haven't been happy in a long time, Walter. I think you know that." I said, "I do now." She said, "I want this to be civil. I think we can work out something fair." I asked her what fair looked like to her. She said, "The house, half the savings, and a percentage of the patent income, going forward." I said we should each get a lawyer. She said, "Obviously." I called mine that same afternoon. Her name is Priya Malhotra, and she's handled every piece of my intellectual property work since 2007 patent filings, 2 prior licensing disputes, all of it. She's 58, precise almost to the point of being unnerving, and she has never once in 19 years told me what I wanted to hear instead of what was true. I laid it all out for her: the conversation, the number Diane wanted, the royalties. Priya went quiet on the phone for a second. Then she said, "Walter, the royalties are going to be the whole fight. How are the patents held?" I told her solely in my name, all 19. "And the licensing agreements?" "Through an LLC I set up back in 2011, Kessler Structural Solutions." "Who owns the LLC?" "I do, entirely." She said, "Walter, I need to ask you something, and I need the honest answer." I said, "Always." She said, "Did Diane contribute to the engineering itself, the research, the design work, any of it in any way that could be documented?" I thought about 26 years, about every weekend in that home office, about a wife who was brilliant at rooms and had never once set foot in a laboratory or a testing facility with me. I said, "No, not technically, not in any way you could put in a filing." Priya said, "Good. Then we have somewhere solid to stand. But Walter, I want to warn you, once a spouse understands the true scale of what the other one built, the offer to be civil has a way of evaporating fast." Her attorney's name was Roland Ashby, 51 years old, a real specialist in high-asset divorces, and according to Priya, he had a signature move in cases exactly like this one. He'd argue that Diane's role as the emotional and social backbone of the household had freed me up to do the technical work that without her managing the house, the calendar, the social obligations, I never would have had the stability to produce 19 patents. That her contribution wasn't engineering, but it was foundational. And foundational, in his argument, was worth a share of everything it supported. Priya called it a creative theory. She said it had worked for him before. Whether it would work here depended entirely on the judge, and on how well Roland Ashby could actually back it up with evidence. I asked her if it could be backed up in our case. She said, "That's what the next several months are going to determine." And those months, my friend, tested my patience more than any seismic retrofit I've ever engineered. Depositions, financial disclosures, the specific grinding machinery of a contested divorce, where teams of professionals sift through 30 years of your life looking for whatever argument best serves their client, not whatever argument best serves the truth. Diane's filing, through Roland Ashby, asked for the house, 45% of our joint financial assets, and 30% of all future royalty income from every one of my 19 patents, 30%, forever, for the rest of my working life. I sat across from Priya in her office, looked at that filing, and thought about Diane at the kitchen table in 2018, staring at that royalty statement. I understood, finally, exactly what she'd been calculating. I said, "Priya, what's our position?" She said, "Our position is that the patents are your sole intellectual work, that the LLC structure keeps the royalty income legally separate from marital assets, and that Diane's contributions, while real, as a partner in the marriage, don't legally rise to the level of ownership in your engineering. It's a strong position." Then she paused. "But Walter, I want to prepare you for something. When the legal argument gets difficult, the personal argument becomes the whole strategy. Roland Ashby is going to put Diane on that stand, and she is going to tell 26 years of marriage as a story about a woman who held an entire household together around a man who was absent, difficult, and impossible to explain at parties. And in front of the wrong judge, that story can move a case in ways the paperwork alone never could." I said, "Then let her tell it." Priya looked at me carefully. I said, "Let her tell every last word of it, Priya, because I've been paying attention for 26 years, and I've got my own record of what actually happened in that marriage. And it's documented." She said, "Documented how, exactly?" I said, "I'm an engineer. I keep records. Lab notebooks, project logs, timesheets, going back to 1990. Every patent application, every licensing negotiation, every royalty statement, every dollar, all of it, organized, dated, and complete." Priya sat back in her chair. "How complete?" she asked. 34 years complete," I said. "Now, my friend, if you're still with me, and any of this is hitting close to home, do me a favor and hit that like button right now, because what happened in that courtroom took every single thing I just told you to set up, and I want you to see it the way I saw it, from the front row of my own life." The hearing landed on a Tuesday morning in May. Going in, I knew Priya had built an airtight response, a structural engineering peer, a forensic accountant, and testimony lined up from 3 colleagues who'd worked beside me across different decades of my career. What I didn't know was exactly what Diane was going to say, only that Roland Ashby had spent months preparing her to say it with conviction. Priya warned me, "Whatever she says up there, Walter, you do not react. Not a flinch. You look at me, or you look at the judge, and that's it." I told her, "Priya, I spent 26 years learning how not to react to things Diane said. I've had practice." She almost laughed. "Good," she said. "Use it." We arrived at the courthouse a little before 9. I wore the Navy suit I wear to present engineering findings to state review boards, the suit for things that matter. Roland Ashby was already in the hallway, and he looked at me the way a man looks at something he's already decided the shape of. The judge was the Honorable Marcus Whitfield, 62 years old, on the federal bench for 13 years, known, Priya told me, for being exactingly patient and exactingly precise. What Priya also mentioned, almost as an afterthought while we walked in, was that Judge Whitfield had an undergraduate degree in civil engineering before he ever went to law school. I filed that away. I file everything away. It's the only real talent I have. Roland Ashby's opening was polished, and it was exactly the story Priya had predicted: the absent husband, the incomprehensible work, the wife who ran the actual, visible life of the household while I disappeared into a world nobody else could see. He used the phrase invisible contribution. He used the word sacrifice more than once. He was good. I'll give the man that. Priya's response was measured, documented, unhurried: the engineering peer's report, the forensic accountant's findings, the timesheets stretching back decades. She was laying brick by brick, the way you do when you know the truth, properly documented, can outlast a well-told story. Then Roland Ashby called Diane to the stand. She was composed. She was, as she had always been, exactly right for the room. Hair done, voice steady, every early answer clear and rehearsed. She described our marriage accurately, on the surface. The long hours, the evenings alone, the dinner parties, where she'd carried every conversation for both of us. None of that was a lie. That was the hardest part to sit through. Honestly, every fact she gave was true. It was the meaning she hung on those facts that had gone somewhere false. And then Roland Ashby asked her the question he'd clearly built the whole morning toward. He said, "Mrs. Kessler, in your own words, how would you describe your husband's professional life and what it gave to this marriage?" Diane looked at the judge. She looked at the gallery. She did not look at me, and she said, "Your Honor, I spent 26 years married to a man who never really amounted to anything beyond a desk job nobody could ever explain to me. I built our life. Everything real in this marriage, the friendships, the family, the memories that was mine. He gave us a paycheck, and not much else." The courtroom went quiet in that specific way. A room goes quiet when everyone in it senses something has just tipped. I looked at Judge Whitfield. And Judge Whitfield, a man with an undergraduate degree in civil engineering, sitting across from a structural engineer he'd apparently never connected the name to until that exact sentence, was looking back at me, with an expression that plainly did not match the man Diane had just described. He picked up his glasses, he set them back down. He looked at Roland Ashby and said, "Counsel, do you have any idea who this man is?" Roland Ashby said, "Your Honor, Mr. Kessler is the respondent in these proceedings." Judge Whitfield said, "I'm aware of his role in this courtroom, counsel. I'm asking whether you're aware of his role anywhere else." Roland Ashby reached for his laptop. He opened it. He started typing. And that's when I watched his hand stop cooperating with him when his portfolio hit the table, half a second. The sound I told you about at the very beginning. Judge Whitfield said, "Counsel, I'm going to take a 15-minute recess. I'd suggest you use it to finish that search. When we reconvene, I'll have questions." He left the bench. Roland Ashby closed his laptop slowly. He turned to Diane, and something moved across his face. I hadn't seen on an attorney before the specific look of a man realizing the entire foundation of his case had just cracked open in front of a federal judge. Diane said something to him quietly. He said something back, quieter still, and I watched two people who'd spent months building a story about me realize, in real time, that they'd built it without ever once checking whether the story was true. I sat back down beside Priya. She leaned in. "What just happened?" I told her, "Judge Whitfield studied civil engineering." She stared at me. "He recognized your name," I said. Priya sat back in her chair, and for the first time in 19 years of working together, I watched something close to genuine astonishment cross her face. "What does he know, specifically?" she asked. I told her the base isolation system, the hospital retrofits, the paper on it that ran in a structural engineering trade journal back in 2019, the one that got picked up and featured pretty widely in seismic safety circles afterward. "If Judge Whitfield reads that kind of material," I said, "and men who studied engineering before law school often still do, he'll know the system. And he'll know my name attached to it," Priya asked. "And the 19 patents?" I said, "All public record, every one. The consulting contract with the state, the conference keynotes, the trade journal features any attorney doing his homework would have found every bit of it in an afternoon," Priya said, very quietly. Which Roland Ashby should have done," I said. Apparently my wife's description of me was thorough enough that he never felt the need to check. The recess ran 20 minutes. When Judge Whitfield came back, he had a legal pad in front of him, several pages deep in handwritten notes. He looked at Roland Ashby and said, "Counsel, have you had the chance to complete your research?" Roland Ashby said, "Yes, Your Honor." There was a pause that ran longer than any courtroom pause should run. He said, "Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief continuance for both parties to revisit the evidentiary basis of the petitioner's testimony." Judge Whitfield said, "I imagine you would." Request denied. He set his pen down and said, "I've sat on this bench for 13 years, counsel. I've handled asset disputes involving business owners, physicians, artists, and professionals of every stripe. I want to be precise about one thing this morning. The characterization your client gave this court that the respondent never amounted to anything is flatly inconsistent with a public record showing 19 granted patents, an active licensing relationship currently protecting 11 hospitals across 3 states, a standing consulting role with a state emergency management agency, and a base isolation innovation that has been cited repeatedly in the seismic safety literature as a meaningful advance in protecting critical infrastructure during major earthquakes. He looked up. I want to make this. I'm familiar with that literature, counsel. I've read it. I studied civil engineering before I ever set foot in a law school, and I have followed developments in structural safety ever since, largely as a personal interest. The courtroom did not make a sound. He said, I am not ruling today that the petitioner's underlying claims have no merit. That determination is exactly what these proceedings exist to make. What I am saying is that the evidentiary foundation of those claims, and specifically the characterization of the respondent's professional life, requires serious re-examination before this court can responsibly proceed. He turned to Diane. Mrs. Kessler, you have the right to reconsider any testimony given this morning, in light of the full professional record of the respondent. Diane's face did something. In that moment, I had genuinely never seen it do in 26 years. Every bit of composure she'd walked in wearing simply left her, all at once. Not in anger, but in the specific, quiet collapse of someone who built an entire argument on a foundation and just watched, publicly, precisely, in front of a room full of strangers, as that foundation turned out not to exist. She looked at Roland Ashby. He didn't look back at her. She looked at me the first time all morning she'd actually looked at me, and I thought about that kitchen table back in 2018, about the royalty statement, about putting up with all those weekends. I didn't say a word. I just looked back at her until she was the one who looked away. What happened over the following month matters just as much as that morning did, so let me walk you through it honestly. Roland Ashby requested and got a 2-week continuance. In those 2 weeks, the fully assembled record of my professional life, the patents, the hospital retrofits, the trade journal coverage, the state consulting contract, the accumulated value the LLC actually held completely restructured Diane's legal position from the ground up. The claim on 30% of future royalties, in perpetuity, quietly disappeared from the filing. Priya had believed all along it was legally indefensible, and the forensic accountant's report had made that case plainly. What those 2 weeks really exposed was that Roland Ashby had built his entire strategy around Diane's account of an ordinary, unremarkable man, a strategy that simply could not survive contact with the actual record of what that supposedly ordinary man had spent 34 years building. We settled in the 4th week. Diane kept the house. She'd picked it out with me 19 years earlier, raised our 2 kids in it, and by any reasonable measure, it was hers as much as it was mine. She received a fair share of our jointly held savings and investment accounts. Priya fought hard on exactly how jointly held got defined, and that fight mattered. She received nothing from the patents, nothing from the LLC, nothing from a single dollar of future royalty income. 34 years of engineering work, documented too completely and too precisely to admit any argument to the contrary. I moved into a small rental about 10 minutes from the house while the paperwork on the sale finished up. I remember sitting on the back step that first night with a cup of coffee, thinking about everything that had just been settled and everything that hadn't. Some things don't settle in a courtroom, my friend, no matter how the ruling comes down. The particular hurt of hearing the person who's supposed to know you best stand up and tell a judge you never amounted to anything that doesn't get resolved by a settlement agreement. What I came to understand, slowly, over the weeks that followed, is that Diane hadn't exactly been lying up there on that stand. She'd been limited. She saw the world through visibility, through rooms and conversations and the things you can point to at a dinner party. And I, out in my home office running load calculations at midnight, was almost entirely invisible inside that particular way of seeing. She looked straight at what I did for 34 years and saw nothing there. That wasn't cruelty. That was a failure of sight, one I'd had a hand in creating myself, because I never once found the words to make my work legible to the person sleeping 10 feet away from where I did it. I want to talk to you directly for a second before I wrap this up, friend. If you've ever built something the people closest to you simply couldn't see, I need you to hear this. The fact that it was invisible to them is not evidence that it wasn't real. It's only evidence of the distance between 2 different ways of understanding a life. My work was real. The hospitals still standing after major earthquakes are real. The 19 patents are real, on file, granted, protecting real buildings, full of real people, right now, tonight, while you're listening to this. None of that ever needed Diane to see it in order to be true. What needed Diane to see it was a courtroom, and a judge who happened to study civil engineering 30 years ago, and one morning when the gap between the story she'd been telling about me and the actual record of my life became visible to every single person in that room at the same time. And I want to be honest with you, that wasn't revenge. I felt no satisfaction watching Diane's face change when Judge Whitfield read that record out loud. I felt nothing but a kind of tired relief watching Roland Ashby's hand shake over his own laptop. Those weren't victories, friend. They were corrections, a record getting set right after being wrong for a very long time. If there's a word for revenge in this story at all, it's the 19 patents themselves. It's 34 years of work that held up buildings and protected people who will never know my name. It's the plain fact of having lived the life I was actually meant to live, whether or not the person across the kitchen table ever understood what that life was worth. That's the only kind of getting even that actually lasts. If this one meant something to you, share it with somebody who needs to hear it tonight. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop me a comment. Tell me about something you built that the people nearest to you never quite managed to see. I read every single one of them. I'll see you in the next story, friend.